Expedia and Visit Scotland invite you to come step into centuries of history that await in Scotland. Castles steeped in legend walk along cobblestone streets. Come share the warmth of stories passed down through generations. This is a place with a past that is fully present today and all yours to explore. Plan your Scottish escape today at expedia.com/Visit Scotland.
Study and play come together on a Windows 11 PC. And for a limited time, college students get the best of both worlds. Get the Unreal College Deal. Everything you need to study and play with select Windows 11 PCs. Eligible students get a year of Microsoft 365 Premium and a year of Xbox Game Pass Ultimate with a custom color Xbox wireless controller. Learn more at windows.com/student offer. While supplies last. Ends June 30th. Terms at aka.ms/collegepc.
This is the Tudors, Dynasty, and Beyond podcast. History with a twist. And now your host, Rebecca Larson.
Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Rebecca Larson. When we think about power during the Wars of the Roses, we usually think about kings and battles and noblemen. But behind the scenes, there was an entire network of women, queens, ladies in waitings, mothers, widows, servants, and noblewomen. They were exchanging information, arranging marriages, protecting one another, and sometimes shaping politics in ways chroniclers barely acknowledged. Today, I'm so happy to welcome back to the show Dr. Lacey Bonar Hull. Welcome.
Hey, Rebecca, how are you?
Oh, I'm so happy to have you back and to talk about this subject in history because to me, you are the go-to on medieval women.
Thank you. That's I'm gonna put that on like a badge and wear it around. That's certainly a badge of honor. I love that introduction because I just think that really gets to the heart of what medieval women, especially at the English court, were all about. We know that, they had agency and they had power and they were making, these big moves, especially during the Wars of the Roses time period, which is the time period I typically focus on. But like you said, it often goes unrecorded that, chroniclers really could have cared less what most women were doing at the time, unless, of course, they were villainizing said woman, which did tend to happen, especially in the later medieval period. But, I'm just excited that there's so much interest in this topic and just feel really honored to be able to discuss some really incredible medieval women today with you. So thank you for having me on. It's honestly my favorite topic. I could go on and on.
Well, when I first approached you to come back on the show, I was like, I want to talk about Jacquetta and I want to talk about Elizabeth Woodville. And that's when you said, I really want to talk about the networks of women at court. And I thought this is going to be an amazing topic.
Yeah, I love Jacquetta and Elizabeth both, and they were both, I would argue, complete powerhouses at the English court. But I think you can't really do their political maneuvering justice unless you talk about some of the other women that they were working with and sometimes working against. And then, sometimes you have women that seem like maybe they would have been enemies, especially during the Wars of the Roses, based on which, house they would have an alliance with. But really, that's just on paper. From what we can tell, these women, even if they were, a member of the House of York versus a member of the House of Lancaster, or, different families that were allied to those two different houses, sometimes the women would still work across this political divide. That if you're just, taking a really zoomed out look and you say, okay, here's, Richard, Duke of York, obviously is working against Henry VI. They're enemies by the time, Richard is making his own claim to the throne. But we can see with their wives, with Cecily Neville and with Margaret of Anjou, they still had some sort of a relationship. It's hard to actually, get at the nature of that relationship obviously, because of what you said at the top, where we don't really have the source base, to be able to speak to that, because no one was really thinking about writing down what women were doing and the relationships that they were having with one another. But I think, when we start to kind of chip away at that a bit, it becomes obvious that these women, they were, political actors in much the same sense that men were, but just instead of carrying out their politics on the battlefield, or, maybe in the deliberation room with the king. Instead, they were working within more like home-based, friendship-based, kinship network-based types of avenues of power, which is so interesting. And Jacquetta was right there. I mean, she was in the mix, and certainly Elizabeth Woodville was. That's, I think she might come to the forefront of people's minds a little bit more often because obviously she became a queen. But I think we need to look at, Jacquetta too, to understand what was happening in the earlier stages of the Wars of the Roses and the role that her family was playing, because the Woodvilles certainly dominated politics there for a bit, not for terribly long. It didn't end well for them.
No.
But they sat at the pinnacle of power, for a couple of years, and really, Jacquetta and Elizabeth really paid the price for that personally through a lot of really devastating losses for both of them throughout their adult lives. But I think it helps to illuminate the time period in a different, and I would argue equally as interesting way, as when you're looking at the men who had, these shifting alliances, like Thomas Stanley, never knew where that guy was going to fall, which he's fascinating. He's so interesting, to study. But, I think the women are just as interesting. It's just they don't often have the same type of spotlight kind of put on them as with other heavy hitters like, the Kingmaker or Richard, Duke of York, or certainly Richard III, and some characters like that people like to study.
Yeah. Well, let's start with Jacquetta because, she is the mother of the queen and she wasn't from England. So let's kind of go just briefly, because I want to make sure we have enough time to go through everything. But let's talk about her background a bit and how she became connected to the English court.
Yeah, so Jacquetta, she came from a really powerful family on the continent. So she's from the royal family of Luxembourg. Her family had actually ruled that area for, I believe it was over a century, even before Jacquetta was born. So she was born into a really powerful life of high privilege, of, high politics. She was raised in this kind of an atmosphere. And then when she was young, she married Henry V's brother, so John, Duke of Bedford, who, if you have ever Googled John, Duke of Bedford, you will see one of the medieval men who surely has one of the worst haircuts. But it was terribly popular. But that poor guy, like I cannot. Every time I think of him, the depiction of him with that just like really bad bowl cut comes to the forefront of my mind. But so that's who Jacquetta married when she was a teenager. He was in his 40s, and he was incredibly powerful in England. And Jacquetta's uncle, we think, likely arranged that marriage with the Duke of Bedford. Henry V had already died by the time Jacquetta married the Duke of Bedford. So Henry VI, was king, but he was a small child. So he wasn't, doing any sort of ruling on his own. Really, all the power rested in his uncles and especially in the Duke of Bedford. So Bedford was sort of like king in all but name at the time. And that is who Jacquetta married. So she's instantly, transported from one of the most powerful families in European politics to being married to arguably the most influential person in England. He, wasn't king, but he essentially was acting as king. We think that, Jacquetta and Bedford would have had a good relationship from what we can tell. They never had any children. They weren't married for long before Bedford fell sick and died. And she spent most of her time, she did spend some time in England, kind of, learning the ropes of the English court, but most of her marriage to Bedford was spent on the continent. He was in France, trying to control the gains that Henry V had made in France before he passed away, which was challenging, probably took a bit of a toll on Bedford's health. and he died not soon, or not too long after the two of them got married. I think it was around a year and a half to 2 years before Bedford got sick and died. So it was a short relationship, but from what we can tell, it was a good relationship. We know that he left Jacquetta almost everything that he owned in his will, which also made her an immensely wealthy woman, and an immensely wealthy widow. But then that's where, so this is where Jacquetta starts to get probably a little scandalous by today's standards, certainly scandalous by medieval standards, and where she really starts to, I think, shine as an individual. So when she was widowed and she was left all this money, and at this point in time, she's considered a member of the English royal family, even though Bedford has died, she's still considered to be one of them because she has all these lands now and all this money. So she wasn't supposed to get married without the king's permission. Henry VI's mother, Catherine of Valois, had a questionable relationship, according to people at the time, and it kind of freaked people out. So Jacquetta was supposed to only get married with the king's permission. The king's a child. Henry VI probably didn't actually care about this, but his counselors certainly did. Yeah. So Jacquetta's brother-in-law and uncles-in-law. And so she was supposed to essentially marry who they told her that she should marry. And they were likely wanting to use Jacquetta to make some, a foreign relationship that was going to benefit England. It wasn't going to be in Jacquetta's benefit. And I think she was smart enough to know that. So according to legend, when Henry VI and his counselors sent over a group of men to retrieve Jacquetta and to bring her back to England as a widow, one of the men who was sent to retrieve her was a young guy named Richard Woodville, who allegedly was super attractive. That doesn't bear out necessarily in the depictions that we have of Richard Woodville today. So if you Google Richard Woodville, it's not quite as bad as John, Duke of Bedford, but he at the time was supposed to be extremely handsome, one of the most handsome men in the realm, and allegedly, Jacquetta kind of set her sights on him. He set his sights on her, and the two of them decided that they were going to marry each other. So he had been a knight, or he was, serving in Bedford's household. So he was considered pretty lowly. He wasn't born into wealth. He wasn't born into status. Kind of like the achievement that he had made was securing a position in Bedford's household to serve him. That was kind of like the height of his power and influence, and then suddenly found himself married to Bedford's widow. So he escalated his position and status pretty quickly, and much to the dismay of many of the more established members of the English court. So the nobility, they were pretty shocked by this marriage. It was, it wasn't unheard of. Women were marrying below their station well before Jacquetta, but it was still a shock because she's a foreign bride. She didn't have those connections at the English court that she could have depended upon to kind of defend her in that decision. But what she did have was a decent relationship with Henry VI, who again, was still a child at the time. And then she would actually go on to be really influential, even with this kind of scandalous marriage. She was still very politically active at court. She was actually one of the people who was selected to go retrieve Margaret of Anjou from the continent when she was, coming over to England to marry Henry VI. So Jacquetta would have been one of the very first people that Margaret of Anjou would have met when she was coming over, to become queen. And even Richard Woodville ended up securing some pretty lucrative positions, at court. So they kind of stomached the scandal, and they immediately started having children. And they had a ton of kids, from what we can tell, a happy and loving relationship between Richard and Jacquetta. So I would say that the scandal was probably worth it to her, but it did present some challenges because, again, she made this scandalous marriage. People thought she was marrying beneath her station. Also, she took away the option for Henry VI and his counselors to use her hand in marriage to establish any sort of foreign relationships that would have benefited her, dead husband's family and realm. And then also Jacquetta, being a foreigner, she, already had some sort of odds stacked against her just because, like I said, she didn't, have that built-in infrastructure of any support on the ground in England. But also she was just sort of like she had like a mysterious, I think, element to her. Something that's really interesting, I think, about Jacquetta that at the time probably played in her favor, but later on in her life, I think, might have kind of worked against her a bit. There was this legend at the time that Jacquetta and her family descended from Melusine, who was a water goddess, a super popular legend throughout, most of the later medieval period, where this water goddess was, I think we would think of her today as being like a half woman, half mermaid, or half serpent. She's actually the inspiration of the Starbucks logo, which I think is really interesting. I have my Starbucks cup sitting here. I don't know if you can see, but is Melusine, and she allegedly is the ancestor of Jacquetta and Jacquetta's offspring. So at the time, I mean, the Melusine legend, it was so popular, everyone would have been familiar with it. Even in England, we have several surviving medieval manuscripts that contain the Melusine legend. We have some really interesting images from those manuscripts where people, would illustrate their own depictions of Melusine in her bathtub, half woman, half mermaid, and her husband, sees her as this mythical figure, and she is she's forced to spend her life as this half woman, half mermaid creature, which at the time it was meant to be like a moralizing tale of, a husband who spied on his wife in the bathtub. He realizes that she's this hybrid creature, and, she flies away and leaves him to raise all of her children. And in some instances of the legend, these children are also, these hybrid creatures. And that's who Jacquetta was supposed to have descended from. So this woman comes to the English court. She's a foreigner. She makes this scandalous marriage. She's allegedly descended from a mermaid. And then she, kind of takes the English court by storm, which is, I think, really, fascinating. I wish we had more surviving primary sources to give us more insight into Jacquetta's life in her earlier years at the English court. We're unfortunately lacking a lot of, any sort of like personal reflection that Jacquetta would have had. I would have loved to have known, more on what she made of the impact that she had on the English court. From what I think I know about Jacquetta, I think she didn't shy away from the spotlight. I think she was fine to shake things up a bit and cause a little bit of scandal. And I wouldn't imagine that she regretted that marriage, even though it, I believe, might have damaged some of those relationships that she did have at the English court. And I think that's something that we see impacting Jacquetta and Elizabeth Woodville years and years, down the road. I think this marriage that she made was something that people might have ignored for the time being. After the rumors would have died down, after the shock of it, would have worn off a bit. I think that even decades later, that unequal marriage is something that came back to bite the Woodvilles and eventually, led to their downfall and led to Richard's untimely death, unfortunately. But it's hard to think about what the English court would have looked like without Jacquetta and Richard having made that decision, because the Woodvilles were still so influential. But it's hard to escape a scandalous marriage and what was considered at the time of being a low birth and someone rising too far above their station, which is certainly what we get with the Woodvilles.
I just have to say, I'm probably related to Jacquetta. I do have ancestors from Luxembourg, and
Really?
that's a small
It
country.
is. Look at you, Rebecca. You're descended from Melusine. Do you, when you take your bath at night, do you grow a mermaid tail? I won't tell anyone, and I certainly wouldn't look in the window. That legend is one of many medieval legends where a woman is like literally doing nothing wrong, and
Yeah.
her life is completely upended by a man, and somehow she still comes out to blame at the end, which is incredibly frustrating as someone who reads a lot of medieval literature and legends. It's just like, oh my gosh, it's a little exhausting at times.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
I think Jacquetta would have worn it as a source of pride, and you
Yeah.
should too if you're descended from Melusine. That's nothing to be embarrassed of. You should embrace it.
I will. Maybe next Halloween I'll dress up as
Oh,
her.
there you go. You should. That would be fun. Please send me pictures.
Okay, I've sidetracked long enough. I do want to get back to Jacquetta and the networks. And, you had mentioned she's at court and she
Mhm.
had brought Margaret of Anjou back. And at some point, she is part of her household too,
Yeah,
right?
she was. And the thing about Jacquetta, it's hard. It's always hard to track ladies in waiting, which is unfortunate because it's one of my, like little special interests when it comes to the medieval period, especially with Elizabeth Woodville, is kind of that's my person if I was to pick a particular person from the medieval period. And I wish we knew more about, especially Elizabeth's roles in Margaret of Anjou's household. But we do know that Jacquetta was pretty much a permanent fixture, always by Margaret of Anjou's side. The two of them were extremely close. They were related by marriage. Of course, we don't know if Jacquetta would have met a younger Margaret when they, were both still on the continent. We don't have any insight into any type of relationship that they could have had in their earlier lives before they were both in England. But we know by the time they were both in England, they likely bonded not just over both being foreigners, but both having to learn the ropes of the English court. And they both came from extremely, powerful families. Margaret of Anjou, one of the real issues that I think the English had with her is that she expected to have more power and agency as queen than the English were used to giving their queens. But that's the environment that she had grown up in. She came from a family of extremely powerful women, and I don't think it's far-fetched to say that that's likely something that Margaret and Jacquetta would have bonded over. We know that the two of them were very close. They certainly would have spent the majority of their time together. With Jacquetta, because she did have so many children, we know that she would have still spent a lot of her time at home, where she likely would have given birth to her children. But we think that she, likely would have still returned back to court pretty regularly whenever she could. And we uh, expect that Elizabeth Woodville would have had a position at Margaret of Anjou's court as a younger girl. So probably starting maybe around the early teens, maybe even as early as 12 years old. And especially when her mother wasn't at court, it's likely that Elizabeth would have been at court while her mother was back home at Grafton Regis having her bajillion children. But again, we don't have the sources that say that. We really annoyingly, and I won't get into it too much because it's really details at this point, but we do have record of an Elizabeth who was in the service of Margaret of Anjou, and it's been debated by scholars for generations if it's Elizabeth Woodville or if it's a different Elizabeth, or is the name really Isabel? Is it not Elizabeth? And it's just an example of I think, how women at the time, people weren't thinking to really record the details of these women's lives. I mean, even Margaret of Anjou, who we do have a lot more records for, obviously, because she came to England as queen. So people were, taking her a bit more seriously. But especially when you get to someone like Elizabeth Woodville, no one would have expected Elizabeth Woodville to have become queen. On paper, she shouldn't have become queen. There should have been no way that she would have become queen. She was not from a high enough up status-wise family in England to be a contender for queen, and also she was English. So she really, at the time, there hadn't been an English queen since the Norman Conquest. So no one would have thought that she ever could have ever risen, to that status. So they simply weren't thinking about recording her movements as a young girl. And really, until, her marriage to Edward IV was announced, we don't even have the details of, that marriage. We don't know exactly how that happened. We have legends. We don't know, how Elizabeth even for sure caught the king's eye. We have later stories, but it's not like it was written down in a primary source that someone would have recorded, today. May 1st, Edward went and married Elizabeth Woodville at her family's home of Grafton Regis. We think that that's likely what happened because that's what the legend says. But Elizabeth and Edward had so many legends, grow up around the two of them, and their, love story was recorded so many different places, not even in England, but also over on the continent, that it's hard to know what exactly did happen and what was romanticized in some of these other sources, which I think is really interesting. But from a historian standpoint, you feel like you always have to qualify it, like you always have to say, well, according to legend and according to some sources, and some people say that it happened this way. But that's what we get with a lot of these women. And with Jacquetta especially, you just kind of have to fill in the blanks with her life, because even though she did come from that noble family of immense power and prestige on the continent, when she's in England, she kind of gets lost a bit in the records. And that was just the case for the vast, vast, vast majority of women at the time. We unfortunately don't have consistent insights into their lives. So instead, we have to take the pieces that we do have and try to fit them together to get the best idea of these women's lives and their movements.
Spring just hits different. One day, cold mud. The next, warm sunshine. But the hard-working men and women in Carhartt don't wait for the forecast to get to work. Patching roads, clearing trails, planting crops. Their hands turn this season's uncertainty into possibility. So get out there, spring into action. We've got you covered for whatever the season throws your way. Carhartt, made possible.
When you need to build up your team to handle the growing chaos at work, use Indeed Sponsored Jobs. It gives your job post the boost it needs to be seen and helps reach people with the right skills, certifications, and more. Spend less time searching and more time actually interviewing candidates who check all your boxes. Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. That's Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need a hiring hero? This is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs.
Let's talk about these networks at court, because, we know that Jacquetta was part of Margaret of Anjou's household. Mm-hmm. You just mentioned that her daughter Elizabeth was likely a maid in the household.
Yeah.
How did these networks form? I mean, like you said at the beginning, these things weren't documented. These women were, so they were kind of flying under the radar by the chroniclers, but at court, did the men know these women were doing these things?
I think so. And that's the other hard thing, is that it's difficult to know, because again, it's not backed up in the sources. No one really thought to keep record on women and what women were doing. But I think, from what we can tell, these women who especially would have been in the Queen's household, so Jacquetta and Elizabeth, would have had access to the king and, so Henry VI at this time was, still functioning as king. He might not have been as effective of a king as, his father or his grandfather, or, Edward the Fourth after him. But he was, it was still very advantageous to have a good relationship with the queen and then to have access to the king's ear. We know that Margaret of Anjou took her position as queen very seriously. We know that, she was trying to benefit not just the women in her household, but also women who were attached to the women in her household or women that she had a relationship with, which is really interesting. We have some examples of Margaret taking an interest in a family friend of the Paston family. So that the medieval family that left us all these letters who, we do get much better insight into the women in that family, even though some of those insights do not shine a good light on some of the women in the Paston family. But, we do have a bit more insights into their experiences than most women at the time. And we know that Margaret of Anjou took a special interest in a family friend of the Pastons, to where Margaret tried to set her up and to arrange a marriage for this really obscure woman who, unless you have the Paston letters, you would have never thought that Margaret of Anjou would have taken an interest in a friend's friend. But she did. We know that she was trying to make an advantageous marriage for this young woman. We don't know why. It's not clear why she would have done something like that for that woman in particular. And the question then is, was she doing something like that for that woman in particular? Or was Margaret of Anjou, working within these networks of women? Was this a regular occurrence for her? Was she trying to help women make these advantageous marriages? Was she helping women that she might not have had a direct relationship with, but one of her friends had a direct relationship with? It's really interesting that it survived because we have the Paston letters. But I don't think that it's a stretch to think that that's something that Margaret of Anjou would have done on more than one occasion. I doubt that this was the only time that she, was working within this network to try and benefit someone, and that she was, using her status as queen to try to make this relationship happen. We know that was pretty common of queens to do for women in their own households. So we have a bit more records on Philippa of Hainaut and some of the efforts that she made to try and benefit the women that served her. We know that she was helping them to make relationships with men who served in the king's household, for example. So the king's household and the queen's household, the people would often intermarry and establish relationships with one another. And I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility to think that Margaret of Anjou, maybe with the help of Jacquetta, would have been trying to make those relationships for the young women who were in her household. What I think is really interesting is when you consider other women at the time. So we know Margaret of Anjou and Jacquetta were very staunch Lancastrians, obviously. Margaret's married to Henry VI. That's the leader of the House of Lancaster. Jacquetta was married to John, Duke of Bedford, another figurehead for the House of Lancaster. And then she and Richard Woodville were very staunch Lancastrians. There was no question about their loyalty when the Wars of the Roses, started to kind of bubble up and tensions started to rise to the surface. Where we get more questions is Cecily Neville, who I think is another really, really fascinating figure. And the fact that these three women were living together, at the same time, they were all contemporaries of one another. I think it's really interesting to think about the relationship between Jacquetta and Cecily in particular, even though, again, we don't have the primary sources to bear this out. But it's interesting with Cecily because she was born a Lancastrian. She's a member of the House of Lancaster. But then obviously she had that loyalty called into question when she married Richard, Duke of York, and then he ended up taking up the claim to the throne. He was the challenger to the House of Lancaster. So you have Cecily, she's really pulled in two different directions, right? She was born into the House of Lancaster. That's who she grew up supporting, very loyal to the House of Lancaster. And then her husband, whatever you want to make of Richard, Duke of York and his claim to the throne, is up to individuals to decide. Some people think that he was forced into trying to take the throne because Henry VI was mentally incapacitated, and Richard, Duke of York, as the heir to the throne, would have been duty bound or honor bound to have taken up that claim. Others think that Richard, Duke of York, always wanted to be king, and he used that mental breakdown of Henry VI to very conveniently push his claim. I suspect maybe the truth lies somewhere closer to the middle of that. But for poor Cecily, she had this relationship with Margaret of Anjou. We think that the two of them were close. We actually do have some surviving primary sources that indicate that Cecily and Margaret of Anjou did have a friendship, right? They had a close relationship. The two of them were talking with each other about things like childbirth and trying to reconcile their husbands and, trying to maintain their own relationship in the face of this adversity between, the houses of York and Lancaster. What we don't know is what Jacquetta made of Cecily. I would suspect, and again, this is not, it's not backed up in the sources, but I would suspect that Cecily Neville, we know that she was very proud of her background. She was proud of of who her parents were, and especially of her relationship to the House of Lancaster and descent, through John of Gaunt. She was very proud of that. We know that she was very proud of the marriage that she made. I mean, her nickname was Proud Cis. So it was something that was known at the time, that Cecily Neville, she knew her place and her family's place in the hierarchy, and she was proud of that. I would suspect that when Cecily discovered that Jacquetta, the other Duchess of England, had made an unequal marriage, I would expect that Cecily would have not excused that decision quite so easily as maybe some of her fellow nobles would have, because status and descent meant so much to Cecily, and doing the right thing, marrying someone who was an equal was something that we think was likely important to Cecily Neville, because it seems that that's something that was important to her family. So I would pay to be a fly on the wall. And I would pay, thousands of dollars to go back in time and to get to see an interaction between Cecily Neville and Jacquetta when Jacquetta had married Richard Woodville, and just have seen the reaction that Cecily had to that. We know that Cecily was not happy when her son married Elizabeth Woodville, probably for a lot of reasons. I mean, it was not a popular marriage. When Edward IV decided to marry Elizabeth Woodville, it was completely out of left field, for a lot of reasons. A lot of the older nobility, the more established nobility at court, were very upset with that decision. Cecily was extremely, from what we can tell, extremely upset with that decision. Allegedly, she, threatened to say that Edward IV was a bastard, that he, and again, we don't know if this is true or not, but there are sources that claim that she, said that he wasn't the true son of Richard, Duke of York, of her husband, and that he should not wear the crown. And whether that happened or not is up for debate. But what we do think we can say is that Cecily and Elizabeth probably had a challenging relationship, at least at the onset. And there have been so many question marks about that. There have been a lot of questions about why would Cecily feel so strongly about Elizabeth? Was it Elizabeth as a person? Was it just because she wanted her son to marry someone else? Is it because she felt like her own influence over her son was then threatened because he made this decision without her? I would be interested to know. And again, if we could find some primary sources that shed some light on this, it would just be a dream for someone like me. But I would be interested to know how much of an impact Cecily's relationship with Jacquetta had on her reaction to Elizabeth Woodville being chosen by Edward IV as his wife. I think a lot of times when we think about Elizabeth Woodville and Edward IV, because the marriage feels like it came out of nowhere, because it does feel like it came out of nowhere, it's people forget about Jacquetta and the role that Jacquetta played at court. Jacquetta was far from an unknown at the English court. Jacquetta would have been right in the center of things. Just because we don't, maybe have the sources that talk about the immense power and influence that Jacquetta had during Margaret of Anjou's queenship doesn't mean that she didn't have immense power and influence during Margaret of Anjou's queenship. We know that the two of them were very close. We know that Cecily ended up having a very strained relationship, obviously, with Margaret of Anjou, likely had a strained relationship with Jacquetta, because we don't have much insight into the two of their, interactions, to the point where you have to question if the two of them were friends, or if they just happened to coexist. Maybe they were just both friends of Margaret of Anjou's, so they had to interact with each other either way. But I think it's really incorrect to assume that Elizabeth Woodville herself was an unknown entity. I think she was very much a known entity. We know that Cecily and Jacquetta would have been, side by side in the trenches of the Wars of the Roses. Whether they were friends or not, I don't know, but they certainly would have been aware of one another. They would have had some type of a working relationship, especially through Margaret of Anjou. And Elizabeth Woodville also would have been a known person at court because of being the daughter of Jacquetta and Richard Woodville. They were both immensely powerful Lancastrians. I don't think it's a stretch of the imagination to think that Edward IV might have encountered Elizabeth Woodville before Edward IV was Edward IV, and maybe when Elizabeth, was at court in her younger years, the two of them, it's not unheard of, I think, to assume that the two of them could have crossed paths. Again, what's very difficult when you're talking about this kind of thing is that it just isn't borne out in the primary sources. A lot of women's networks, women's agency at court, the movements that Jacquetta and Elizabeth and even, Cecily would have made, it's not recorded. If you don't have something like the Paston letters, where they just happen to mention something that Margaret of Anjou has done, we wouldn't have known that Margaret of Anjou, took an interest in participating in these women's networks. If we didn't have the surviving letter from Cecily to Margaret asking if they can try and maintain some sort of a relationship, and trying to make sure that the two of them can still have a friendship even in the face of their husbands having a tense relationship themselves, we wouldn't have known that Cecily was trying to use her own personal relationships to navigate what had to have been such a difficult time for her. And when it comes to Elizabeth Woodville, she is such a question mark, because the sources they don't survive for Elizabeth and for Jacquetta. We don't get those glimpses into their earlier years at the English court. Where they really kind of come into their own is when Elizabeth does marry Edward IV, which is why it feels like Elizabeth and the Woodvilles came out of absolute nowhere, that they were completely just lifted, just plucked from obscurity, because Edward IV saw her on the roadside and thought she was pretty and decided to marry her. I mean, is that really realistic? Knowing Edward IV's reputation as a womanizer, I would not be surprised to know that he kind of set his sights on someone and pursued them. He likely did that several times. But to think that Elizabeth Woodville was a complete unknown and that the Woodvilles themselves were completely unknown is just incorrect, because we know that Jacquetta, she was central to these women's networks at court. And Richard Woodville even was pretty influential at the court of Henry VI, and then ended up becoming influential again during the reconciliation of Edward IV, prior to Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville. So these women, they can seem like surprising choices. They can seem like, surprising people to pop up as a marriage candidate to the king. But I don't think at the time would have been quite as shocking for the people at the English court, because they would have known the power that Jacquetta had held during Margaret of Anjou's queenship. And Elizabeth Woodville herself, would have been active at court. We just unfortunately don't know the extent of that, just because of the lack of source survival.
Yeah.
I'm starting to realize as we're talking about this that this is a two-part episode. So I'm going to
It
have to have
probably is a two-part episode.
so
There's a lot to say.
there is, but I feel like, I want to help me understand because we know
Mhm.
that these women's lives weren't really documented. So how do we know? What evidence do we have that these networks existed?
Yeah, so we really have to mine the primary sources, and sometimes you have to, it's like a puzzle. Like you have to take the primary sources that have survived, and then you have to try and fit them together to get a fuller picture, but it's never going to be a full picture just because we don't have things from the medieval period, very annoyingly. We don't have things like diaries or even very many personal letters. The letter collections that we do have, they do shed some light on what some women were doing. We, unfortunately, women feature pretty popularly in like political propaganda. So you get these allegations of especially like sexual immorality and illegitimacy for some of these women. So they pop up there, but again, you have to read those sources with an eye to like sexism and misogynistic tendencies. Because, like you said at the beginning of the episode, Rebecca, when chroniclers are even talking about these women, it's often not in a good light. But at least they're talking about them a little bit. So we get a little bit of insight from chroniclers and the written sources that we have, especially that would have been written by the religious elite, kind of chronicling the different events of different years in the late medieval time period. But again, you still have to read those with an eye to not just political bias, but also just bias against women seeking any sort of, not even agency, but just any sort of like independence of self. Because, if a woman made one wrong move, she could be written about by these different chroniclers, and they were not often friendly to women. Margaret of Anjou, maybe more than anyone else, her reputation really suffered in part, because she was a woman, but also because she kind of had the odds stacked against her politically, and then being foreign. But we do get insight into some of these women through their own personal letters. So we do have surviving letters from Margaret of Anjou. We have surviving letters from Cecily Neville. And then really interestingly, we can get some insight into them through book networks. And I hate to even go into this because this is another one of my obsessions, and I could talk for a really long time. And I know we have maybe one other episode to do this, but I know, we don't have all the time in the world that we would need to talk about women's book networks, but we can track friendships through, it's essentially like medieval book clubs. We have these manuscripts that women would take and they would sign their names on them, or someone else, would sign their name to say the woman that was reading that particular manuscript, and then she would pass it to the next person, which I think is just, it's so fascinating. And it goes for any type of manuscript. So the Arthurian legends, for example, were really popular. And there's one, that we know passed through hands of the Woodville family, and then, would have passed on to their friends. And you can kind of piece together like some friendship networks through just manuscript trade. And we think, that people would have read these stories together as like a form of entertainment, which I think it just gives us such a really interesting insight into not just medieval entertainment, but how, medieval friendships likely worked, that they, would have been reading this book together and then getting together to talk about it, much like we do with book clubs today, which I think is so neat. But you really, you have to be kind of creative with how you piece together these different networks, because it's not like we have a written record that says Margaret of Anjou's closest friends are Jacquetta, Cecily, and then parentheses, Cecily is sort of on the outs because of her questionable husband. We don't have even the records of, like, with men that we know, we're fighting on certain sides of battles. We don't even have records like that for the women, which, is an obstacle to figuring out the role that women's friendship networks played at court. But I think that as long as we responsibly read the sources with an eye to women and to women's avenues of power that might look different from what we're used to analyzing when we're looking at power at the medieval court, I think it starts to kind of come into focus a bit. There's some really exciting work being done on women's friendship networks and on illuminating the lives of especially ladies in waiting, women, who were part of the Queen's household. And I think it's exciting. It's an exciting time to be interested in women's networks because I would assume within the next decade, we'll have a lot more coming to light, not just for the medieval period, but also for the Tudor period, which I know your listeners are hopefully interested in both. Why would you be interested in Tudors and not in the medieval period? But it's exciting. I think we've had centuries where women have been ignored in these records where, it's been sort of taken for granted that women, even at court, didn't really do much. And when they did do anything, they messed it up, like Margaret of Anjou, is often blamed with doing. But, I think now, really over the last probably 50 years or so, people have been taking women more seriously in the historical records, and they've been digging for them. And you really do have to dig. My doctoral dissertation that I wrote for my PhD, one of my committee members, when I was defending, she said that my dissertation was sort of like a recovery effort. Like you were trying to recover these women's stories that had been buried for so long, and you're trying to kind of, bring them back to the surface and bring them more into focus. And I think that's something that can be done. It just, has to be done responsibly too. You can't make too certain of claims with the records that we have available to us just yet. But, there could easily be something sitting in the archives in London or in Oxford or, on the continent that might help to bring these women's stories, a bit more definitively to the forefront, which, I'm always hopeful that we're going to find more things, especially with women who might have served in the royal household but weren't royal themselves. Yeah. I think we have a shot at finding some stuff that illuminates Jacquetta and Cecily, I think. And I would love, everyone always, they ask, if you could find one thing in the archives, what would you find? Which is a conversation, very, very dorky conversation, but a conversation that historians have because we think about this stuff all the time. And I think for me, if it wasn't something about the Princes in the Tower, which is my medieval mystery obsession. So if it wasn't something about the Princes in the Tower, it would have to be something about the relationship between Jacquetta, Cecily, and Margaret, because they just seem like three such strong personalities trying to coexist at a time when their husbands were at each other's throats. And then knowing this can be the last thing I say, because if I get into the Kingmaker, Rebecca, we're really not leaving. We'll have to save that for episode 2. But the absolute hatred that the Kingmaker, who was Cecily's nephew, had for Richard Woodville, I mean, it seems like pathological, that something had to cause that just, I mean, it was just hatred. There's not a softer word to describe it. The Kingmaker, he despised Richard Woodville. Why? Why did he have such a strong opinion? What if Richard Woodville really was this like political non-entity that a lot of people like to chalk him up to being? Why did the Kingmaker hate him so much that he murdered him and got away with it? Yeah. It's just, I think there's a lot of unpacking to do there, I would think, between the Woodvilles and the Nevilles. And I think Cecily and Jacquetta likely played a key role there because there was no love lost between the men, from what we can tell, in those two families. But the two women, they both, I mean, they had to coexist. And it's just really interesting. It's an interesting thing to think about. I wish we had some sources that spelled that out a little clearer. Because it's such an interesting animosity that the kingmaker has to someone who we don't know why. We don't know, what did Richard do that made the kingmaker hate him so much? Yeah. It's very intriguing. And I spend a lot of my time thinking about these people, way too much time thinking about the kingmaker, because that's, one of my top 3 people in history that I really don't like when we're talking about the Wars of the Roses time period. But, thinking about his motivation, someone who arguably was the most powerful man in England, might have even been more powerful than Edward IV. I mean, we have record of people saying that England has 2 kings. One is the kingmaker and the other, I can't remember his name, about man. Edward IV, which I think is kind of hilarious. But also, kind of illuminating that why does this man who has so much power, who literally creates kings, why does he have such a vendetta against Richard Woodville? And it's so sustained. It's really, really intriguing. I wish we had more information about it. And I think some information might lie with that relationship between Jacquetta and Cecily.
Oh, what a wonderful teaser for the next episode. I feel like we can talk about that, and then
can we talk about the kingmaker?
Yes, we'll talk about it all. And of course, the next episode, I definitely want to get into the relationship between Elizabeth Woodville and Margaret Beaufort. I'm like, there's so much that we have to cover. So this was very enlightening for me today. I know the listeners are going to enjoy it. And I have to say, I've been doing a lot more medieval episodes in the last couple of months. And I can tell just from the number of watches that people have been yearning for these episodes.
Oh, I love that. This is all music to my ears, Rebecca. Yeah. It's time. It's time for the medieval period to be in the spotlight a little bit. I love the Tudors, but man, some of that medieval stuff, like, you cannot make that up. It was a brutal time period, but such a fascinating time period to talk about. So thank you for having me on. I'm looking forward to round 2.
Yes, I can't wait. We'll see you again soon.
Thanks, Rebecca. Bye.
And that concludes another episode of the Tudors Dynasty and Beyond podcast. This podcast would not be possible without the wonderful support of my generous Patreon patrons. If you'd like to become a patron, you get commercial-free episodes, early access, and exclusive content. Head over to Patreon, that's patreon.com/Tudors Dynasty for more information. Until next.
Athletic Brewing Company crafts award-winning non-alcoholic beers for those who want to be part of every round. With over 185 flavor awards, they're exceptional NA beers that fit your lifestyle and any social occasion. Summer's full of good times, and Athletic fits right in. Go to athleticbrewing.com to have brews delivered to your door, or find them at a bar, restaurant, or store near you. Near beer. Athletic Brewing Company. Fit for all times.
This Father's Day, when you ship UPS Air at the UPS Store, your items arrive on time or your money back, guaranteed at no extra cost. It's like the father of all shipping services. It shows up to the airport way too early, just to play it safe. It's overprotective about all the things that truly matter, and it's always prompt, especially to be with family. Make it your first choice to celebrate your dad. Ship UPS Air with our money-back guarantee, exclusively at the UPS Store U.S. retail locations. Visit the upsstore.com/airshipping for full details. Terms and conditions apply.
Next time.